All right, everybody. Well, welcome back to our last little mini lecture video for this first module of this class, where we are talking about the 5 core ideas of behavior theory. And that, again, is the focus of this class. I have posted for you in the module lots of other information that goes along with these little videos, so make sure you're looking at that. But I wanted to use these little mini video lectures to just kind of make sure that we are all on the same page, and I can kind of go through and give a little bit of just a bit of brief, but a little bit of a description of what it is we're kind of talking about in this class. And the focus right now, again, is we're just trying to make sure we have a good handle and a good understanding of this helping approach called behavior theory. So every theory has its core ideas. So when you take your counseling theories class, DAC 1311, you talk about person-centered theory and psychoanalytic theory and maybe Gestalt or Adlerian, or you talk about existential or cognitive behavior or whatever it is your professor wants to talk about in that class. And what you really do is you talk about the core ideas of each individual helping approach, because that helps us to understand what is that approach sort of teaching us or showing us about what it believes about human nature, human behavior, human struggles, human strengths, and then also too, it gives us then tools that we can use as we work with people and work with others in a helping setting, whether we're a caseworker or an advocate or a therapist or a social worker or whatever it may be. So behavior theory, like all of the theories, has some core ideas. There really are more than 5, but I think that there are 5 just very foundational core ideas. Number 1, behavior has 3 forms: physical, verbal, and cognitive. Behavior is what we do, it's what we say, and what we think. That's the first core idea. Second core idea that this theory is built upon is that human behavior is always happening. We cannot not act. So it takes what we call a positive view of human behavior. Behavior is always happening. Third core idea is that this theory is less interested in the labels that we often use to describe behavior, and instead it's more interested in the actual specific verbal, cognitive, or physical behavior that people are engaging in. So there's a de-emphasis on labels. So those are the first 3 core ideas. Let's look at number 4 and number 5, and then that'll be it for these little video lectures for module number 1. Core idea number 4, as you see highlighted in your lecture notes and your PowerPoint presentation, is another one of those de-emphasis ideas. Not only does behavior theory de-emphasize behavioral labels, it also de-emphasizes human feelings and emotions. Now that gets kind of confusing and concerning sometimes to students whenever we talk about behavior theory. Sometimes students will say, well, Professor Killian, I thought our feelings and our emotions were an important part of us. Well, they are, absolutely they are. This theory does not ignore emotions and feelings. It's just more interested in something else. Well, what is it more interested in? Well, it's more interested in behavior. And so you know that our behavior and our emotions and our thoughts, which we'll talk about more later in this class, in many ways are wound up in each other, but they're different from each other. So we have behavior, we have thinking, and we have feelings. And even though it feels like on any given day all those things are kind of wound up in each other, all kind of in one big ball, we often separate those out. And here's what behavior theory does. Behavior theory sees our feelings and our emotions as separate from our behavior. We have behavior and we have feelings. They're interrelated with each other, but they're different from each other. And behavior theory is more interested in physical, verbal, or cognitive behavior than our emotions. Now, again, that doesn't mean that our emotions are not important. There are a lot of counseling theories, like Freud's theory and Albert Ellis's CBT, which we'll talk about a little bit later this semester, that are really interested in that emotional part of us. But this theory is more interested in the outward observable behavioral part of us, less interested in the emotional part of us. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number 1, human behavior is easily observed and measured. Behavior theory is interested in observable, measurable behavior. It's difficult for us to easily observe and measure our emotions. I mean, it's possible, but that's harder to do. Our emotions are more internal, and our emotions are kind of complicated, right? You can feel 2 emotions at one time. You know, you might someone who you are close to, who you love, and you have a deep sense of love and affection for. But at the same time, you can be frustrated by that person. You can love someone and be frustrated by them at the same time. Well, that's just the way our brain, our minds, or our emotions are wired. But that gets kind of complicated because you've got sort of two emotions happening at one time. And how do you easily measure, emotions, and how do you easily observe emotions? Usually, we observe emotions, and we usually observe and measure emotions really through our behavior anyway. So behavior is more easily observable and measurable. Emotions are not. So that's why behavior theory says, you know what, we're just not as interested in human emotions. Second thing is this. This class is called Behavior Modification and Cognitive Disorder. I usually just call this class the Behavior Modification class. You've heard the term behavior modification. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the next couple of modules. The term modification just means change. Behavior change. Behavior modification means behavior change. So we'll talk a little bit later in this class about how this theory teaches that you and I can change our behavior, and we do it all the time. We act like, and we talk like, and we think like we can't change, when in reality, we change all the time, according to this theory, which we'll talk about a little bit later, right? So human emotions are hard to change directly. Now, can we change how we feel? Sure we can. But have you ever had anyone say to you, stop feeling like that. Don't be angry. Don't be upset. Be happy. As if we can just flip a switch and, okay, I'm happy, now I'm not. Well, we discourage people from talking like that. When I was working in counseling, occasionally I would hear people, like in a family session, they'd say, don't feel like that, just be happy. And I would say, hey, wait a minute, time out. That's really not how emotions, you just don't turn emotions on and off, right? Our emotions are much deeper than that. And so it's hard for us just to change how we feel just like that. It's just the way we're wired. So because of that, that's another reason why behavior theory is more interested in outward observable behavior, because we do have a little bit more direct control over our outward observable physical behavior than we do the internal emotions. So for those two general reasons, that's why behavior theory is less interested in, it de-emphasizes human emotions or feelings. It's more interested in behavior. It's more interested in the concrete. Right now, I'm going to say this. For those of you who are going to work in counseling, oftentimes it's important. We work on different levels with people. If you're in the room and you want to be a clinical social worker or a drug and alcohol counselor, we work on different levels with people. And sometimes, like in your basic counseling skills class, you might practice, like an open-ended question like, so how did that make you feel? Or how do you feel about that? Well, that question implies, getting people to look at their emotions and their feelings. Is asking people about their emotions important? Absolutely it is. Our emotions are an important part of us. But that question is not always the best question. Sometimes when I worked in counseling, I would ask people, to think about their emotions. There were other times, though, when I would say this. So what do you want to do about that? That's not really an emotion question. That's more a behavior question. So or I might ask a client, what do you normally do? So you're talking about your girlfriend, you and your girlfriend. When your girlfriend gets really upset, what do you normally do? How do you normally react? That's a behavior question. It's not a feeling, it's more, so how do you react? Well, I get upset too. I start yelling. So that's more of a behavior, right? And so sometimes in counseling, we have to balance those kinds of questions. Focusing on feelings and emotions, getting people to think about how they feel. It's very, very important. Other times, though, it's a little bit more behavioral, we would say. So what's something that you could do about that? What's something different you could try? What do you want to do next? What's something you could do? All those are behavior questions, not emotions. They're more focused on the observable behavior, right? And so this theory is one of those theories that's focused on that. So it de-emphasizes not only labels, it de-emphasizes feelings and emotions. And again, remember, de-emphasize does not mean ignore. It just means more interested in something else. What is this theory more interested in? Observable, measurable, physical, verbal, and cognitive behavior. Less interested in emotions. So that's 4 core ideas. That means we got 1 left. So let's go back to kindergarten for a little bit. Let's talk about the A, the B, and the C. So one of the last core idea to behavior theory, the 5th core idea, is what I call the ABCs of human behavior. One of the things that this theory teaches us is that a really simple way to look at human behavior, now that we understand what is human behavior, here's a way that we can like analyze it. Here's a way for us to kind of start breaking it down. Most of you in the class are probably analytical in nature, right? You have to break stuff down. Well, here we go. A, B, C. Antecedent is the A. B is behavior, which we've been talking about. And C is consequences. Antecedent, behavior, consequences. So let's talk about A for a second. And the word antecedent just really means trigger. It really means something that comes before. So an antecedent is usually, not always, but usually something happening around me in my environment. It can include the behavior of other people, or it could be the weather, or it could be my social environment. It could also be something inside of me, like being bored or being tired or being hungry. An antecedent is something that happens before behavior. Antecedent, then behavior. Now here's why the A and the B are important. This is really important. One of the things this theory teaches is that when we act, that's B, it's almost always in response to something happening around us, that's A. So when you and I, sometimes we don't understand why we do what we do. This theory teaches us through A, B, C, that most often when you and I do something, say something, or think something, that's B, behavior, it's almost always in response to something else happening around us, an antecedent. So understanding the antecedent of a behavior is really, really important. Helps us to understand the behavior sometimes. So usually our behavior is not out of the blue. It feels like it's out of the blue. But this theory says, you know what, most of the time when you and I act, it's in response to something happening around us. And when you look at the environment in which a behavior occurs, it helps us sometimes to understand and make sense of, and then plan for change of that behavior. Many, many years ago, I was working as a counselor in a counseling center. I was a counselor intern. And the counseling center where I worked had some groups that met in the evening time, and I facilitated a couple of those groups. And I had a lady who was she was on my caseload. I was doing one-on-one counseling with her. And we had a ladies group that met like on Monday night. And I encouraged her, hey, listen, if you want to go to the ladies group on Monday night, you can go to the ladies group if you want to, or you can come and just work one-on-one with me, or you can do both. And I wasn't leading the ladies group. One of our female therapists was leading that group. And this client of mine just said, you know, I think I'm going to go to that ladies group and try it out on Monday nights and see if I like it. I said, man, go for it. So she went on Monday night. I think I saw her like on Wednesday. And she came in one Wednesday and she said, man, I didn't like that group on Monday night. And I said, oh yeah, tell me what was going on. Here's what she said. I freaked out in group on Monday night. And now freaked out's one of those labels. And I said, freaked out, what do you mean? She said, I freaked out. And I said, well, like what happened? She said, I got upset and I started yelling and screaming. I just walked out in the middle of group. So there's the behavior. So the behavior, first she used a label, freaked out. I didn't know what that meant. Then she described it. She got upset and angry, she yelled, and she walked out of the group in the middle of the group, didn't go back. That's behavior. So I kind of understood what she did. What I didn't understand was why she did it, right? So I know that she freaked out and she left. I just didn't know why. So I just asked her. I said, well, why did that happen? She said, I don't know. I just freaked out and left the group. So as she was telling me this story, it sort of sounded like this freaking out was like out of the blue, some alien taking over her body, or some, is what it sounded like. It sounded like real mysterious. And in my mind, I'm thinking, no, there's a reason why. I didn't say that to her, but in my brain, I'm thinking there was a reason why. I said, really? I said, you just walked out? Yeah. Well, why do you think I don't know. I just freaked out and left. And in my mind, I'm thinking, this doesn't sound right. So we kept talking, and I finally asked her this question. What were y'all talking about in the group? What were y'all talking about in the group when you freaked out? She said, oh, I don't remember. I said, you weren't paying attention? Because I knew she knew. I could tell. She said, well, I won't go into all the detail, but she said, she told me how there was a lady, at least initially, she said, I had no idea. So in other words, kind of the story was, I don't know why I did I don't have no idea. My hunch was, I bet we can figure it out. What was going on in the group, the environment, when you engaged in this behavior of freaking out. And she told me there was a lady in the group who was talking about losing a child of hers as a baby. So another lady in the group was describing, it sounds like in great detail, losing an infant. And she said, I freaked out. I said, oh, okay. See, so the other group member talking about losing a child to death, an infant, a baby, that's the antecedent. That's like the environment, right? Then comes the behavior, freaking out, right? And once I kind of got a handle on, well, what I was really asking her was, what was going on in your world when you did that? When you did that behavior, the behavior is freaking out, getting upset and yelling and walking out. That's the behavior. What was the environment though? In what environment did that occur? That's the antecedent. Antecedent is the trigger. And once she told me that, a little light bulb went off and we had a little conversation about, well, what was it about that conversation that upset you so much? And we got into a long, deep conversation about her own trauma and her own loss in her own life, which I did not know about. And so understanding, trying to understand, well, why did, I know what you did, I just want to know, let's think about why you did it. So antecedent is anything that comes before a behavior. I've put a little antecedent handout for you in the lecture notes this week, so go take a look at that. Antecedent behavior, that's A, B. Well, we know what B is. B is physical, verbal, or cognitive behavior. We got that, all right? So we got A, we got B. What is C? Consequences. Have you ever heard the phrase behavior results in consequences? There you go. C stands for consequences. Now, in the next module, we're going to camp out around the idea of consequences. But but for just the sake of this conversation, I want to make sure you're aware, antecedent, behavior, physical, verbal, cognitive, consequences. The idea here is this: when you and I act, behavior, we experience things as a result of our behavior. Our behavior has an influence on the world around us. We don't live in a vacuum. So one of the core ideas with the B and the C from this theory is that when we act, things happen. When we behave verbally, cognitively, physically, we experience consequences back to us as a direct result of our behavior. Behavior results in consequences. Consequences are anything that comes after and as a result of my behavior, whatever it is. We're going to talk more in the next module about consequences. I'm going to give you some examples of the types of consequences that we can experience. Social consequences, material consequences, biochemical consequences, social consequences, right? We're also going to talk in the next module about how we perceive the consequences often influences what we do next. So the consequences that we experience, not only does behavior result in consequences, our behavior is influenced by the consequences that we experience as well. That's coming in the next module. For this conversation right here, this fifth core idea is ABC. Antecedent, something happens around me, whatever that is, an antecedent. I react, behavior, physical, verbal, or cognitive, as a result of something happening around me. And when I act, that's B, behavior. You and I experience consequences, right? So this idea of behavior and consequences goes back a long, long way. But really where it goes back to is this counseling approach, behavior theory. Behavior theory is really the first counseling approach that really put an emphasis on this idea that our behavior results in consequences. You want different consequences in your life? Act different. We're going to talk more about that a little bit later. It's a really simple idea. You want different consequences? Different behavior equals different consequences. Same behavior, same consequences, right? And we draw from that idea, by the way, all the time. If you're a parent and you have teenagers, or if you work in counseling like I've done for years, we draw from that idea all the time with our clients. Hey, what do you want to be different? I want this, and to be different. What are you willing to do? What are you going to do to get that different? Because if all you keep doing is the same old thing, guess what you're going to get? The same old thing. Behavior results in consequences, right? So we'll talk a little more about that a little bit later. But this idea that when we act, our behavior brings back to us consequences. Antecedent, behavior, consequences. Really, really quick, and we're going to be done. Idea number one, human behavior has three forms: physical, verbal, and cognitive. Our physical and our verbal behavior is outward and observable, so therefore it is an example we call overt behavior. Our cognitive behavior, because it's somewhat covered up, is also often referred to as covert behavior. Core idea number two, behavior is always happening. We cannot not act. Idea number 3 and 4 are similar. They're both de-emphasis ideas. Idea number 3, this theory de-emphasizes the use of behavioral labels. Not interested in the labels that we oftentimes use, instead interested in the specific verbal, physical, and cognitive behavior that we engage in. And also too, this theory, fourth idea, is that this theory is more interested in behavior as opposed to feelings and emotions. A de-emphasis on feelings and emotions. Last idea, A, B, C, antecedent, behavior, consequences. Oftentimes our behavior, B, is in response to something happening around us, an antecedent. And when we act, B, our behavior results in consequences. That's C. Antecedent, behavior, and consequences. Come back next module after you work all your way through this module, module number 2. Like I said a second ago, we're going to talk a lot more about behavior and consequences. Have a great couple of weeks. I'll see you back here soon. Let me know if you need anything. See you next time.